dun, dun, dun. We are waiting for a few more people to pop in. There's the numbers going up and up and up. I love it. Seeing a bunch of people in there, making our guests tonight a little bit nervous. I love it. Oh, 86. Look at that. That's a lot of people. 88, 90. Can we hit 100 before I start the intro? Can we do it? I hope so. 93, 4. We're almost there. 99. Oh, and 100. Okay, here we go. Hello and welcome to the Skeptical Inquirer Presents. This is a series of live online presentations from leading experts in science, skepticism, medicine, media, and activism, all devoted to the cause of advancing science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theories, and critical thinking over magical thinking. Every 2 weeks, I'm stumbling my words. Skeptical Inquirer Presents will bring you a new live event, normally emceed by the brilliant and hilarious comedian Leanne Lord. That's co-host of the Point of Inquiry podcast. But due to mysterious circumstances that even the most psychic could not psychic, you get me instead. I'm just kidding. Psychics can't psychic. They're not real. Anyway, my name is Kenny Biddle. I am the chief investigator for the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, and I'm guest hosting tonight. Ghost stories and monster sightings have long been an important way for humans to deal with their fears of the unknown. Often these tales come from situations where folklore stepped in to explain science that people just didn't understand yet. Nowhere did this play out quite as spectacularly as in 18th century Serbia, where a misunderstanding of disease spread and natural post-mortem changes gave life to a legend we now know today as the vampire. Tonight, we'll be enjoying a presentation by the Spooky Science Sisters. Meagan is a geologist by training, a chemist by trade, and a lifelong Halloween enthusiast. In 2020, she took her love of all things spooky and her passion for science communication to the podcasting world and launched the Spooky Science Sisters podcast with her sister-in-law, Paige. Paige is a chemist by training, works as a safety professional, and is an EHS graduate student. Also a lover of Halloween and horror since childhood, she enthusiastically joined her sister-in-law, Meagan, as the co-host of Spooky Science Sisters. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Meagan and Paige and let them do a awesome and spooky presentation for all of you. So, take it away, Meagan and Paige.
Great. Hello, I'm going to share my screen here and then we'll jump right in. And I got to hit slideshow. Looks good, Paige?
I can see it.
Great. We're off to a good start then. Okay, well, I am Meagan.
And I am Paige.
And like Kenny said, we are the sisters-in-law of Spooky Science Sisters. And yeah, today we're going to talk about some monster science.
But before we get started, first I want to thank Kenny and just Skeptical Inquirer Presents for having us today. And before we sink our teeth in today's topic, we wanted to share a little bit more information about us and our journey here. So as Kenny mentioned, we started as a podcast, the Spooky Science Sisters, and that podcast came about in the early days of the 2020 COVID lockdown when Meagan's frustration with the overall lack of skepticism in the paranormal podcasting space and our shared love of science and all things spooky came together. Basically, Meagan decided she wanted to do a podcast on a topic we were both interested in, and with my debilitating case of FOMO, or fear of missing out, I had no choice but to join her. Now, after 5 years, we've taken a lot of what we've learned during podcasting into our first book, which is titled Spooky Science: Dissecting the Mysteries of Ghosts, Cryptids, Aliens, and Other Oddities. Spooky Science was published in June of this year and is the reason we're here today.
Yeah, and we first came across Skeptical Inquirer in early 2020 when we referenced Kenny's work for our second episode on ghost hunting. Kenny was also the first guest to ever be on our show. But since then, it's been an invaluable resource for us. So this really sounds like or feels like a full circle moment. So we're really honored and excited to be here.
While writing the book, our goal was to create something that encouraged critical thinking while making conversations about science fun and accessible to a wider audience. And though we and Spooky Science have been referred to as relentlessly skeptical, we are adamant that beliefs in the paranormal and the paranormal science relationship are an essential part of our development, both culturally and as individuals.
Yeah. So, what we mean by that is basically with the podcast, with all of this, we're never setting out to tell anyone that they shouldn't believe in ghosts or other spooky things, because belief in monsters and ghosts is near universal. And when it comes to ghosts, is known to date back thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. And monster stories are probably just as old. So the statue that is shown on this slide is the Lowen-Mensch, which was carved out of ivory about 35,000 to 40,000 years ago. And some people consider it the oldest known evidence of humans inventing a monster-like creature. So it is a man with the head of a cave lion. So clearly something monstrous or mythical that these people have made. But importantly, scary stories help us to process a lot of difficult emotions and worries about the world. And you obviously don't have to believe them to enjoy them. Paige and I think it's just as fun to think about the science behind some of these beliefs, which can be equally creepy as the stories themselves. And what we and many others before us have learned is that science and the paranormal have gone together for as long as we've been telling these scary monster and ghost stories, because a lot of times a supernatural explanation is a stand-in for science that we just don't understand yet or didn't understand yet.
There are obviously a lot of really good examples of this. We literally have an entire podcast and now a book about it, but it includes things like the ancient Mesopotamians and other ancient cultures using angry ghosts to explain illnesses, or the psychological purpose for the boogeyman. Children will invent their own boogeyman to help conceptualize fears they are otherwise struggling to process. Or there's a biological component to it where parents feel compelled to keep their children safe and might invent a boogeyman to instill fear in a child to keep them from doing something dumb or something that will get them hurt. But our favorite example of this and our main focus for today's presentation is
Vampires! Yay!
But first, before we talk about vampires, we have to establish what a vampire is. And people probably already have a specific one or type in mind. So before we get started, I want everyone to take a second to think about your favorite vampires. When you think about them, what do you see? What do they look like? What is their story? If I had to guess, most of us probably saw something similar. They are hot, pale, and equipped with fangs. They've likely become a vampire after being bitten themselves, and they will burn, blister, or maybe even sparkle in the sunlight. All of these traits, including physical appearance, creation stories, and weaknesses, vary over time and over different cultures. And there's really not a single list of characteristics that define every vampire. However, almost all vampire myths have at least one thing in common, and that is that vampires survive on human blood.
Okay. So, Part of the reason that we see so much variation in vampire characteristics is that there are examples of vampires or vampire-like creatures in folklore in almost every culture, and they date back to the beginning of civilization itself. So we get these blood-drinking demons from Mesopotamia, Persia, and ancient Babylonia. They also show up in ancient Greece and Rome. Several of these vampire precursors specifically preyed on children. So, in that case, I would guess that we're trying to see people, or we're likely seeing people trying to explain things like high child mortality. In Celtic folklore from Ireland and Scotland, we get sort of the girl power version of vampires. So there are several examples of blood-sucking feminine spirits or creatures who lure specifically men to their doom and exsanguinate them. So we love that. And in China, there are the Jiangshi. And these are vampire-like creatures that in more modern portrayals can only hop after their victims since their undead bodies are still very stiff. And rather than drinking blood, so they're sort of the exception, they drain the life force from the living. And one of the fun quirks that I just can't not mention about the Jiangshi, but that also shows up in later Slavic vampire folklore, is that they compulsively count things. So if they encounter a pile or a sack of rice, they have to count every piece before they move on. So it's in folklore, it's this good way to slow them down so that way the person can escape. And we like it in particular because it's become part of the accepted lore for Sesame Street's Count Von Count, that he suffers from this compulsion to count things.
So, where does the medical science come in? Well, the connection between vampires and medical science was established in the early 18th century in Eastern Europe in association with Slavic folklore. And this is also where we got many of our modern ideas about vampires and their behavior. More specifically, it's in two small villages in Serbia that we see this spectacular intersection of early medical science and superstition that sets the stage for vampire stories for the next 300 years. And just FYI, beyond here, we're going to be talking about dead bodies and some pretty gross stuff about human decomposition. There won't be any graphic photos, but if body horror and gore is not your thing, well, at least we can say you've been warned. So the first of these villages is Kosiljevo, and in 1725, one of the villagers, a man named Peter Blagojevich, died of unknown but natural causes. Not so unusual at first. This happens, but about 10 weeks after his burial, 9 additional people mysteriously passed away over a period of as many days, with each of them claiming on their deathbed that they received a posthumous visit from Peter. The terrified villagers did what I guess any terrified villager would do in this scenario and dug up Peter to investigate what he might be getting up to, and were shocked by what they found when they opened his coffin. Peter's body wasn't as decomposed as they had expected. His nails and hair had appeared to have grown. There was fresh blood present around his mouth. All of this, the villagers believed, was evidence that Peter was a vampire. So they drove a stake through his torso to end his nightly reign of terror. And it's worth noting that this is really where that tradition of staking vampires comes from. But the staking wasn't necessarily to kill the vampire, it was to physically pin them back in their grave.
Exciting. All right. So Kosiljevo is not the only place affected, and I'm very proud of us for learning that pronunciation. That same year, 1725, another small town that's about 125 or 120 miles away, called Medvegia, also started to have vampire problems. And this time, the suspected vampire was a man named Arnold Paula, or Arnold Paul, if you go with the anglicized version. But he was a soldier who had recently moved to the village from a Turkish controlled portion of Serbia. And in Arnold's case, he had a self proclaimed run in with a vampire while he was away at war. And he was able to kill that vampire, but was bitten during their fight. However, he believed that he took the appropriate and I'll note super sanitary precautions to avoid becoming a vampire himself. He ate dirt from its grave and rubbed its blood on the bite wound. Unfortunately, and for him, it seems like it did not work. So Arnaud's bad luck continued, and just a few months after he moved to Medvegia, he ended up dying in an accident. And a few weeks later, just like with Peter, 4 additional villagers died due to some unknown illness. And those villagers reported again that Arnaud visited them in the night. So, you guessed it, Arnaud gets dug up too, and they find fresh blood around his mouth. His hair and nails had grown, and when they staked him, more fresh blood poured out of the wound, and he let out an agonized groan. So clearly, these were all signs we were totally right. He was a vampire. So they dig up his victims and they stake them as well to try and take care of the problem. So, unlike in Casilievo, things do not just end there. Things were quiet for a few years until 1731, but that's when the problem started again. And that time around, 17 villagers died in just a few months from alarmingly to the other villagers, a very similar illness as that experienced by Arnaud's victims 6 years before. And one of these new victims even reports that she only became ill after one of the earlier victims attacked her in the night and specifically throttled her. So this time around, Medvegia calls in reinforcements, and first comes a military doctor from a nearby town named Dr. Glazer. And Glazer is not super impressed with the vampire idea. He tries to blame the deaths on malnutrition, but he begrudgingly agrees that when they dig these bodies up, the bodies are a bit odd in terms of decomposition, and he puts in a recommendation to his superiors that they go along with the locals' wishes to stake and burn the bodies again. So the military leadership that he reports to are not super thrilled about this, and they decide to send in another investigator, and this time it is a doctor named Johannes Fluckinger, and he comes all the way from Vienna, Austria. And Johannes examines the bodies, or exhumes the bodies again to examine them. And based on the lack of decomposition and the other weird features that we mentioned, he says, guys, these are vampires, and they should be staked and beheaded, and we should burn the bodies. And he also concludes that the reemergence of vampires in Medvegia after that 5 or 6 year break is because Arnaud Paula, the original vampire, also fed on young livestock, and that later infected the villagers that ate them. So we get sort of this hint of some infectious aspect to this. Okay, so Johannes goes on to publish a report about Paula and the events in Medvegia, and it goes the 18th century version of viral. And on this slide, you can see a couple sheets or pages from his report, and then also a news story that was published later as well in London, I believe. But yeah, people understandably sort of freak out about this, are very interested in this because this is a medical doctor who's releasing an official report saying there was a vampire outbreak. This is the first time that we see the wide appearance of the word vampire across the English-speaking world, and the influence of the events in Serbia also slip into pop culture, because we know that while Bram Stoker likely based his Dracula on historical figures like Vlad the Impaler, you can definitely see the influence of Slavic folklore in his behavior and characteristics. And I will note that this is especially evident in the recent Nosferatu movie made by Robert Eggers, which, among other reasons, is worth a watch if you are morbidly curious about how the staking of Arnaud and Peter might have gone down. Okay, so yeah, a lot happens in Serbia. But the cool thing here about what goes on and what the villagers are doing and what Glazer and later Johannes Fleckinger end up doing is that, even if we don't agree with their conclusions that, something supernatural is going on, the villagers and these doctors that are called in were conducting medical scientific investigations to the best of their abilities and knowledge at the time, and then obviously letting sort of folklore dictate what happened next. So, what we can do is ask ourselves, what were they missing, and what explains those weird bodies that didn't decompose right and led them to declare, we've got vampires running around Serbia.
So, to start, they lacked an understanding about how disease spread. From a modern standpoint, people coming down with and dying from sudden onset fevers and falling ill one after another doesn't seem that surprising, considering we're talking about rural villages in Serbia 300 years ago. But some of those deaths also weren't so sudden. A few people did take a few months to expire. But at the time, illnesses and even accidents that led to deaths made people suspicious, and they were convinced that something supernatural was going on.
So, another big thing going on here is that they didn't have a good understanding of the speed at which decomposition happens or what happens during the decomposition of human bodies, especially those that have been buried. Formal studies on human decomposition wouldn't even be conducted until centuries later. But I would say that even today, people would probably underestimate the speed at which buried bodies will decompose or putrefy. And I note on here that this is probably why I'm on some sort of watch list, because this was certainly a part while we were researching for the book that I remember Googling, spending a lot of time Googling human decomposition. How fast does a body decay? How fast does it decay if you bury it versus leave it out? I was like, somebody thinks that this is very suspicious right now. But what we know is that a corpse that is buried at a depth of just 4 feet, so like not even the full 6 that we do these days, can retain most of its tissue for about a year. And that's because the temperature underground is significantly lower than at the surface, and the body is more protected from animal and insect activity. And in the case of Glazer and Fleckinger, where they're exhuming these bodies, they're digging them up in December and January. So in some cases, they've probably been more or less refrigerated. So like you wouldn't expect them to be as decomposed as they might otherwise be.
However, decomposition was still happening because, as it turns out, the other signs of vampirism are evidence of putrefaction. So, for example, the fresh blood that was found around the mouth and nose that spilled out when the vampires were staked probably wasn't blood at all, but was fluid accumulating in the body as the internal organs started to decompose and liquefy. Yum.
Lovely.
Some of that fluid also known as liquefied organs, would have started to ooze out of the various orifices as the body began to swell, which is caused by an accumulation of gases inside of the body. So, staking someone and quickly releasing those gases could have created that strange groaning sound as the gases were forced past the vocal cords and out of the staking wound. Finally, hair and nails that may have appeared to have grown could have just been the soft tissues around the hair and nails starting to retract. So that explains the events in Kosiljevo and Medvegia, but they're really just the beginning of the link between vampires and medical science, because we also have to explain other vampire outbreaks and explain the behavior of vampires while they're out of their graves. Things like, why do they desire blood, or why people might believe they can't go out during the daytime. And this is where various medical conditions or diseases have been suggested to explain stories about vampires. So the first medical condition we'll talk about is the one with the strongest link to vampire outbreaks, and that's tuberculosis. Also known as consumption, the disease causes the infected to physically waste away, with symptoms including weight loss, pale skin, chronic cough that often contain blood. You could see how someone might think a fellow townsperson with tuberculosis has actually turned into a vampire. But what we know today is that active tuberculosis is highly contagious and spreads through air from person to person. So the time when one family member would fall ill, it was only a matter of time before the rest of the family also got sick. The disease would often wipe out entire households, and with nowhere else to turn, people turned to the supernatural for answers. They would blame the earlier deceased victims, claiming they must have been rising from the dead to feed off their living family members. To which I say, that's kind of rude. The link between vampirism and tuberculosis was then solidified in the late 1800s during what's known as the Great New England Vampire Panic, when the tuberculosis pandemic devastated the region. Family members of the deceased would exhume dead bodies, and if the corpse showed what they believed were signs of vampire activity, they would mutilate the body, sometimes staking, removing, and or burning the heart to prevent them from coming back at night and tormenting their families.
Do what you gotta do. So up next, in terms of diseases that people have associated with vampire outbreaks, is a group of rare blood disorders known as porphyria, which is actually commonly referred to as the vampire disease. Porphyrias are more specifically inherited metabolic disorders that cause organic compounds known as porphyrins to accumulate in excess in the body. And that accumulation primarily affects the skin and the nervous system. So, what is a porphyrin? So heme is an iron-containing porphyrin and a part of hemoglobin, which is what carries oxygen to the blood and gives blood its red color. And an example of another type of porphyrin is chlorophyll. So that contains magnesium and obviously is known for giving plants their green color. So they're everywhere. It's not great if you have too many of them. All right, so some symptoms of porphyria that might make people suspicious here include people have fragile skin that can suddenly get very red and irritated and that is sensitive to light. And if exposed to sunlight, you can often get painful blistering of the skin. And the excess porphyrins can also cause a red discoloration of the teeth and urine. So you can see why some of these might be confused for characteristics of a vampire. This person can't go out in the daylight without, being covered in blisters or a rash. And then you think, well, maybe this person is drinking blood because their gums look bloody and their urine is blood colored. However, and this is honestly, this is probably the most common disease that I see brought up with vampire outbreaks and how vampire outbreaks relate to disease. Uh, I just really want to note that the neurological symptoms of porphyria do not include aggression or violence. And for that matter, neither do tuberculosis. And there have been some people that have proposed that drinking human blood could ease the symptoms of porphyria, but there's no evidence that receiving any extra heme from an external source would cure the disease. So that's sort of dead in the water. So long story short, maybe you could explain a few alleged vampire cases with porphyria, but it's not this like catch-all diagnosis that I think some people kind of present it as.
So the third medical condition is catalepsy, which is arguably one of the more terrifying explanations of why people believed vampires were rising from their grave at night. So catalepsy is a neurological condition that could explain why some of the exhumed bodies may have moved in the grave or displayed other unusual characteristics, often linked to diseases such as epilepsy, Parkinson's disease, and schizophrenia. Catalepsy causes immobility and stiffness in the muscles, during which the heart rate and breathing slows down, and there is a decreased response to external stimuli. And while the condition typically only lasts for a few hours, it can, in some cases, last for days. So, with today's diagnostic tools, this condition seems like it would be pretty simple to diagnose. But at a time when doctors didn't have access to modern medical equipment, a person in a cataleptic state could have been easily mistaken as dead and prematurely buried, which might be an irrational fear, but is definitely a fear of mine. Any shift of the body, traces of blood, or post-burial injuries found on those exhumed bodies were likely the result of a failed escape, not late-night vampiring.
All right, so we've gotten past the scariest one. The final example or disease that we'll talk about tonight is rabies, which might be a little bit of a surprise, but it is pretty popularly associated with vampirism, and that's because of symptoms like insomnia, agitation, excess salivation, and the urge to bite. It's also been proposed that it could explain this sort of folkloric idea that vampires have an aversion to garlic because rabies can cause a sensitivity to strong odors. Um, but when it comes to, again, this sort of being a popular explanation, rabies has actually been known as a disease and as a contagious disease for a very long time. Like there are accounts of rabies that go back thousands of years. So unless we're talking about really remote areas, people probably would have recognized it for what it was. Like they would have recognized, oh, this person got bit by like this weird acting wild dog or whatever. And like now they're acting really weird. They probably would have figured it out.
Speaking of rabies, though, the rabies virus is also a possible explanation for some werewolf stories, which I'm sure isn't a surprise to people. And though it may seem easier to make the jump from rabid dog to werewolf, vampires may actually have a stronger tie to the virus because of an increase in rabies cases in Eastern Europe around the same time we saw the Serbian vampires turn up. Many of the possible explanations associated with vampires are also associated with werewolves, and interestingly, Slavic folklore does not distinguish between vampires and werewolves. In fact, sometimes a vampire would become a werewolf when it died. Now, we couldn't do a presentation about monsters, especially one that references werewolves on Halloween Eve, without at least mentioning Peter Stuba. So after a series of brutal murders and other violent crimes terrorized the village of Bedburg, Germany in the late 1500s, Peter was accused of and confessed to being a werewolf. and was famously executed on Halloween night in 1590. Now, what we see in his story and other werewolf stories like his is a stronger history associated with mental health. Basically, it was easier for people at the time to come to terms with a person being, well, not a person than it was to accept that somebody could commit a series of heinous crimes or to understand and diagnose somebody with a rare psychological disorder.
Yay. Shirking my duties. Okay, so some final thoughts on vampires. So there's a lot of medical reasons that might explain why people told vampire stories, and we've gone through some of the most popular ones and sort of the genesis of that in Serbia. And it's definitely bled over into our pop culture. This link between vampires and medical science shows up in Bram Stoker's Dracula because Dr. Van Helsing attempts to bridge the gap between vampires and medical science. And, whether it's purposeful or not, the connection continues in modern pop culture with characters like Carlisle Cullen in Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series and Matthew Claremont in Deborah Harkness's All Souls trilogies, who are actually medical doctors themselves. And then I also wanted to point out that, here we are talking about vampires and them being tied to the history of medical science and the development of medical science. But there were times when medical science got pretty dang vampiric for a while in real life because you've got things like using leeches to facilitate bloodletting. Okay. So, one of my other favorite examples of the intersection in science and monsters in pop culture is actually a fictional monster, and that is Frankenstein's creature. And so I couldn't do this presentation again without talking about this. It was this and Peter Stubo. We knew they had to make it in. But in this case, unlike vampires, who are creatures that were created by a lack of scientific understanding, here's an example where a monster was created, at least in part, based on fears about science itself, and that people might have taken things too far. So there are a couple of spooky science factors that help explain Mary Shelley's famous novel. So the first is galvanism. So while she was growing up and around the time that she wrote Frankenstein, scientists were dabbling around with galvanism, and they were applying electric currents to animals and, more terrifyingly, the corpses of people, often like convicts who had been executed, to simulate them coming back to life. So she's aware of these experiments going on and, the sort of ethical implications of conducting them. And then also my PhD is in volcanology, so I can't not mention that Shelley got a helping hand with the dark, dreary vibes for Frankenstein because the summer that she wrote it, 1816, is known as the year without a summer. And this was after the 1815 eruption of Tambora, which is a huge volcano in Indonesia. And it suspended massive amounts of ash and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the planet for many months afterwards. You had this volcanic eruption that had global climactic effects. So while she's writing, she's hanging out with her husband, she's hanging out with Lord Byron in Switzerland. And that summer, they're stuck inside because it's rainy and cold. For context, in the US, so closer to home here, during that summer, you had snow in June and July in New England and failed crops, and it was a very difficult situation for a lot of people. So, circling back though, in terms of this idea of being afraid of science itself and whether or not things have gone too far, Frankenstein isn't alone. We've got Godzilla, who's another great example of a fictional monster that came out of societal fears that science had gone too far with dropping the atomic bomb. But we also see examples of, for lack of a better term, real life creatures that fit this bill. Both the chupacabra and Mothman are rumored to be a lab experiment gone wrong in the case of the chupacabra, and potentially born of toxic waste from a munitions factory in the case of Mothman. But in general, as science and our understanding of natural world has advanced, our use of monsters to cope with fears has been relegated more and more to the realm of fiction. I wouldn't say there's a lot of people out there who believe there are vampires roaming around, although they do exist. Not vampires, the people who believe they exist. And overall, all signs point to us continuing to turn to the supernatural the same way we have for thousands of years. And I think, and Paige thinks, that there are ways to embrace that while still encouraging critical thinking and skepticism. So with that, we will say thank you for hanging out with us and listening to us talk about vampires and monster science. This is all the information of where you can find us. If you would like to, you can email us. You can go to our website, which has links to various social media and the podcast and everything else. I'm most active on TikTok and Instagram. I also make spooky science themed videos. So there are handles for that. And I will be at the 50th CSI Con anniversary happening in Buffalo next June. So hopefully I will see some of you there. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. All righty then. We got some questions. Are you ready for some questions?
No.
No?
Yes.
Oh, come on. You did so good. You did great.
I can't promise we'll have answers, but we'll
You
hear
d-
questions.
You did good. Before we get to the questions, I got some notes here. Let's see.
Of course.
Is there let me change the view because I'm only looking at you one at a time. There we go. All right. So I have to say that being buried alive has been a constant fear since I've learned about safety coffins like many,
Mm.
many years ago. When I learned that they actually made coffins in case you were buried alive. I was like, no, I'm not getting buried. Nope, never, never,
Yeah.
never. Put it in my will right now. Um, I have a quick question before we get to the viewer questions, which we have quite a few. Um, so when I read the book, and I have the book right here because it's awesome. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. Great job. When I read the book, I was curious about the early vampire stories because even though when they dug up the corpse and they found quote unquote fresh blood on their lips, there doesn't seem to be any reports of anyone getting bit or actual sucking of blood
Mm.
going on. Is that what you found too?
No, so that's a detail that I guess we, just didn't include the exact detail and I didn't mention it tonight, but it's either Arnaud or Arnaud or Peter, but there are definitely stories about one of them biting people
Oh,
or
okay. All right.
ingesting blood. So that's definitely part of it.
Okay. Yeah, because I think I read like Peter, some of the people that claimed he was the one coming to visit them, like ended up just sitting on top of them and choking them or laying on
Yeah,
top.
yeah, throttling
It's like,
them. Yeah, but there's
okay,
definitely stories about people getting bit
okay,
as well.
all
So
right,
that's definitely part of it.
all right. So let me go through some of these questions here. So we got about 15 minutes or so. Michelle asks, has there ever been a case, even a teeny tiny bit like a Scooby-Doo scenario of a human trying to scare people away using these kind of stories, I guess?
Trying to scare people away. Meaning just trying to
So
freak other people out.
I guess I mean when you watch the old episodes of Scooby-Doo, usually it
Oh,
was a monster that was trying to scare people away from the land so they could get it for cheap or
yeah.
just get people away from them.
Yeah, so I don't
Definitely.
know about monster stories. I would totally guess that at some point throughout history, someone's been like, I'm really gonna mess with people and like dress up like something scary and really freak them out, and then it becomes, this fantastic story that people tell later. I know that there have been examples of people dressing up and messing with people, dressing up like ghosts and messing with people. In one case, and the name of the guy and the fine details escape me right now, but like he ends up getting shot and killed because people like were really freaked out and chased him down. There was a recent case though where I think someone was like hanging out in a cemetery somewhere in Europe and like got fined or something because they were pretending to be a ghost and messing with people. So
Yeah, I
it's
did
a
read
thing that
about that. I
happens
did.
recently
Yeah,
as
I read about that.
well.
So the
Yeah.
only thing I can think of is the people dressing up like clowns, but not exactly the same
Oh
thing.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and yeah, there was just the family who thought that they were like masked people trying to break into their house recently, and then it
Yeah.
turned out that it was just their family members messing with and it became this huge story. So yeah, I mean pranks are totally part of it over time, and yeah. We
Okay.
hide a wolf mask in each other's houses periodically, so
Nice. A real quick comment from Douglas says, not a question, but thank you to Megan and Paige for the fantastic presentation. See, I told you.
Well, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you. Listen, we were
Let's see.
terrified.
Carl asks, have you ladies heard the lore that vampires are either afraid of or unable to cross moving, running water under their own power, only on a boat, bridge, or in their coffin? Hmm.
I feel like it sounds mildly familiar, but I'm not haven't have yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not familiar.
Okay. That's good. Let's see.
But now
Moving
I gotta look into it.
on.
So
Yeah, I know. See that I'm always making notes, because this is stuff. This is homework.
yeah, like
I
why
love that.
wouldn't vampires be able to swim? I don't know.
You would think because if they're the undead, they're dead. They should float, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm making this up as I go. Uh, let's see. Somebody asked, what was the inducement for Peter? What is this? Peter Stobo? Stobo? Is that right?
Stuba. Yeah,
Scuba.
Stuba?
Stuba, or you sometimes see it as like Stoomp. There's several variations of his name depending on I think like
Okay.
what
I'm.
country was publishing the pamphlet, whatever.
Oh, big props on the pronunciation too. I mean, you nailed it. I would have totally wrecked those those
Oh, yeah.
names.
Well, I'm still not 100% sure that we were right, but we got as close as we
All right.
could and
Here's what I'll
we
say
practiced.
I'm gonna take
48
your word
hours
for it.
ago, I wrecked every one of them. So we've made progress.
So what was the inducement for Peter Stebo to confess? Was he tortured and promised a
Mm.
painless death?
Yeah. So this is my okay, this is a whole thing for me.
Uh-oh.
Sorry, Paige,
Here
I'm
we
taking this.
Go for it. You're
So,
excited.
yeah. So this is one of the things about Peter is there's sort of like three ways of looking at his story. You can say like some people will say like, well, he was actually this like sadistic murderer who killed all these people and like ate parts of their bodies and stuff like that. You can say that some people say that he's like one of the first cases of clinical lycanthropy, which is a psychiatric disorder where people actually believe that they are an animal. And, it's sort of named for wolves because that's popular, but not necessarily wolves in some case. But in his case, he maybe believed he was a wolf and was acting as one. The third option is so Peter made his confession under torture, which like famously, like people will say anything to make the
Right.
pain stop. So I am not totally sure, but I tend to gravitate towards this idea that Peter like was potentially just a scapegoat for like whatever was really going on in this village, maybe for somebody else. But yeah, he confesses under torture. His execution is like not for the faint of heart. It was not great either. So that was basically torture as well. They go on to also execute his, I forget if it's his daughter-in-law, or if it's his actual daughter, and his mistress, like just for being associated with him. So there's all this stuff about his story where it's like, who's the real monster in this case?
Right.
Like, because it might not have been Peter. So I feel very strongly about it. So I'm super happy that someone asked that question.
Excellent. We have Rob Palmer. Hey, Rob. He's asking, what got you both interested in this topic?
Spooky stuff, or Paige, you go first. I'm chatting it up. You gotta do
Yeah.
yours first.
Yeah, I was gonna ask the same thing, spooky stuff or vampires, but I'm gonna assume spooky stuff. And I think for both of us, it kind of started in a similar place. Meagan, I think, has a slightly different story, but for me, like, I sort of just gravitated towards like kind of creepy books as a kid. I was a porcelain doll collector. I guess I still am. I don't display them, but I have them. I sort of always just like gravitated towards like the creepy things in life. Loved Halloween as a kid. Had a mom who made the best homemade costumes, so it was always my favorite time of the year. And yeah, it just kind of, I think, was natural. I think I was sort of just like born into the spooky life. But when it comes to like vampires or the topics that we've covered, um, I mean, it's sort of just, I don't know. We've sort of just like
I think,
I don't
well,
know.
I know both of us read a lot of romantical style fiction
Yeah.
about vampires.
There it
We're
is.
both like
So there's
big.
definitely that. Listen, if someone wants the reading list, we can provide it.
Say,
Twilight fans.
we are both
We were,
like
yeah.
big
I
Oh.
will
Twilight.
unashamedly defend those. Okay, but yeah, so the other thing I want to mention though, so basically the same reason, like I was born the day after Halloween. So it's just like, who doesn't love that when you're a kid? Like, you get to dress up in costume, get a bunch of candy, and then the next day it's like, oh, it's cake and presents now. So it was like a big 1-2 punch for me. But I will also say that for both of us, like, neither of our sets of parents were like messing around when it came to scary stuff. So in my case, my parents like took me to see Jurassic Park in theaters when I was 5 years old. And I cried the whole time, but then afterwards was like, let's do it again. I watched the X-Files from like very early seasons. They let me stay up late and watch it, so that was like a big deal for me. And I will say, so I'm married to Paige's brother, and her parents. So at one point, he told them, "Oh, I'm not scared of anything. No movie can scare me." And so they were like, "Great, we're gonna watch Nightmare on Elm Street." And he was like 9 years old, and it like ruined his entire life. And he, was super freaked out for days afterwards.
You
So
just outed my parents to 120 people.
well, my point is that probably like they didn't mess around when it came to you and like letting you watch spooky things.
Right.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's just sort of always been a thing for us.
My uncle took me to see the original Friday the 13th when I was 7 years old
There you go.
in a drive-in theater. And I remember cowering down in the back seat because I was like, why am I here? Why am I here? Please get me out of here. But now I love it.
Yeah.
Now I love it.
Yeah, right.
Well,
Okay.
and I reference it in the book, but the story Coraline, I think that came out when I was in like first or second grade, and it became my favorite book. Like, I was obsessed with it. I read it multiple times. Yeah, so
Cool. All right. Another question comes in. Where did the story of vampires morphing into bats and vice versa come from?
Oh, that's a good one. And I do not remember.
I would say I don't remember either, but if I had to take a guess, I would imagine that it has something to do with the rabies connection.
Maybe.
I don't know.
Listen, I've
Okay.
definitely talked about it before. I've definitely read about it before. Couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Okay. Fair enough. So I'm gonna go with I'm gonna try not to butcher this name. Kathy says, "Have you ladies ever heard of the Bunicula?
Oh,
Bunicula?
Banicula?
Is that it? Did I say it right? Yes! I am so proud of myself. Yes.
Yeah.
Bunicula series written by James Howe, and you might want to include Barnabas Collins, who captivated the US in the 60s in Dark Shadows.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I read the Banicula books and loved them. They're so cute. It's like about a little pet rabbit who but he sucks the juice out of carrots. So
Carrots aren't juicy.
well,
That
you
feels
can-
like the perfect
you
Meagan
can
story.
make carrot juice.
All righty.
I'm gonna be honest, Kenny. I thought you were having a hard time pronouncing Kathy there for a second.
Oh, you know what? I did lead up to that. Like I didn't think of it before I opened my mouth, which is usually what happens. I speak before I think. But yeah, I'm glad I'm glad I said I'm terrible with names. So I saw that and I was like, I'm starting to panic. I'm like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
One last thing, I real quick because we got about 5 minutes before we're done. But I I grew up in around Philadelphia area, and outside of Philly, there was a cemetery that had a witch's grave, and
Mm.
it was called that because it had a cage on top of it, and it was something that I asked around, nobody knew what it meant. One lone iron cage on top of this grave, and I know you both touch on it in this book. Can you tell us what they really are?
Yeah, with
Paige.
the limited time we have, long story short, a lot of people now, I think more than ever, have referenced those and talked about how they were a cage to keep undead in the grave. But the purpose was actually to keep grave robbers out of the grave.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's much less like dramatic, but I
Yeah,
guess it
yeah.
served its purpose. I get it. I understand it, but it sounds better when it's like there's a witch or there's a vampire in there and it's keeping them in the ground. But oh well. All right. So that is it. That wraps up this show. You both did an excellent job. It was very entertaining. I enjoyed it. I was sitting here like, wow, this is cool. I love this. I love having the authors pretty much tell me about the book that I read. This is great. So great job. Meagan, we will see you at SciCon. Paige, I still think you should cancel all your plans and show up anyway. I'm going to say that. I'm going to keep saying it every time I talk to you because I would like to meet both of you in person. But thank you again for coming on. I appreciate it. And for everyone that's home, come back in 2 weeks. We're going to have another show and we're going to have fun. So that's it. I'm going to
Yeah.
end this. And it's a hard
Thanks.
stop. So I'm going to say goodbye now.
Okay. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.